Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Ask Dan, where I answer your photography questions right here on the channel. If you'd like to get a question in to be answered on a future episode, you can click the link in the description below. And if you'd like to offer me a little bit of extra love and help support the channel in a very personal way, you can click the little heart-shaped thanks button right here below the video. Okay, so let's get started with episode 4 of Ask Dan! The first question comes from Gloria from California. I actually know Gloria from Instagram. She lives in LA and shoots a lot of really cool stuff around Venice Beach. Gloria's question is, exactly how does the dynamic range setting work in the Fujifilm X Series cameras? This is a good question because a lot of Fuji shooters know about the dynamic range setting, that it's on their cameras, but I think a lot of people don't know exactly how it works and how to use it. Basically, the dynamic range setting is a tool found in the Fuji cameras that allows you to control contrast when you're shooting in JPEG mode. And this control has 4 different settings: auto, 100%, 200%, and 400%. The lowest value, 100%, allows you to increase contrast in your scene when you find yourself shooting in very low contrast situations. The higher 2 values, 200 and 400%, actually decrease contrast when you're shooting in very high contrast situations. When you're using the 2 higher values, the camera automatically underexposes the picture just a little bit and then selectively brightens the darker areas to help reduce the contrast. And this is so you can retain some of your shadow details without blowing out the highlights. However, due to the way that this setting functions, these specific values only work at certain high ISO settings. For example, the 200% setting only works at ISO settings of 400 and above, and 400% only works at ISO settings 800 and above. When this is set to auto, the camera will automatically choose between 100 and 200%. The 400% setting can only be chosen manually, again, if you're shooting at ISO 800 and above. Okay, so that's how this setting works. But which setting should you actually use in real-life shooting situations? Personally, this is one of the settings that I've never really been concerned with when I'm shooting with my X Series cameras, even when I'm shooting in JPEG mode. And that's not because it's not a useful setting. It's simply because when I'm shooting in the moment, I'm usually concerning myself with other specific camera settings like film simulations, exposure, maybe manual adjustments of the highlight and shadow tone, framing, how am I going to capture the scene using autofocus, stuff like that. In a busy shooting situation, it's simply impossible to pay attention to every single setting and bring those into the mix. So it's just a matter of being selective and choosing the most important settings that I feel are going to affect the photograph. Most of my Fuji cameras are either set to auto or 100%. And honestly, if you ask me what my camera is set right now at, I wouldn't even know. It's one of those 2 settings. So here's kind of my answer on how to use this setting. If you're generally happy with the way your Fuji JPEGs look, and you already have a set workflow of the functions and settings that you like to use, then maybe let this one go and don't worry about it. However, if there are times where you wish that you had a little bit better control over your contrast when you're shooting in very high contrast situations, go ahead and experiment with these different settings and see what they do. Get a feel for how they actually render different types of scenes. And that's going to be the best way to figure out how to use this in your own photography. And again, if you already feel you're getting great images and you don't want to add one more thing into the mix, then go ahead and leave it at auto or 100%. And I promise you, even if you leave this setting completely out of the mix and don't adjust anything, you're still going to get great looking Fuji JPEGs right out of the camera. If you're shooting RAW, it doesn't matter because these settings don't come into play. Question number 2 comes from Richard from Bedfordshire, UK. Richard asks, I enter international competitions, but in general, landscape images don't do very well, and not just mine. What can be done to add impact to our landscape photos so that they stand out from the crowd? This is a really interesting question, and I think it highlights the fact that photography and art can be a very subjective thing, and each viewer is going to take something different from an image. As to why landscape photos in general don't appeal to people at competitions, I don't have an answer for you there. I don't have much experience with photography competitions, so I can't really speak to that. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that there are so many great landscape images out there in our world. Anybody who spends enough time on social media or looking at magazines or anything like that, we're all inundated with really fabulous landscape photos. And I will say the quality of landscape imagery over the years has increased, and the bar is set pretty high now simply because there's so many more people doing it, and great images are so much more prevalent and visible in our everyday lives as viewers. So it could be because people are somewhat jaded to landscape images and more drawn to people or action or wildlife images. Somehow those are more relatable. Who knows? But at any rate, I can give you a few tips that'll help you increase the strength of your photos, and maybe that'll get you some awards. Or at least help you stand out from the rest of the images in the crowd. Number one is fantastic light. Shooting in really beautiful light is going to be the most important way to add drama and excitement to your images. Photography is all about light. It's all about capturing light. And if you don't use really good and appealing light in your photographs, then they'll generally fall flat. And that's not a rule 100% of the time, but for the most part, great light will often lead to a great image. In most cases, using amazing light is one thing that will definitely elevate the quality and the visibility of your images. Number two, have a very definable subject and photograph it in such a way, compose so that you actually accentuate that subject. You want to create a composition so that their eyes are immediately drawn in and captured by whatever it is they're supposed to be looking at. And accentuating that subject in a really prominent way is going to help that. Then once they're in, you can help lead them around the frame. And a really effective way to do this is to use secondary subjects that relate with the main subject in such a way that it speaks some kind of story or narrative or highlights a certain relationship or a contrast. So include other elements that play off of that main subject in a really compelling way. And again, they help tell a story or incite some kind of meaningful relationship. Another way to increase drama is to do something a little different. Instead of using a wide-angle lens, use an extreme telephoto and focus on some very small but distinct details of your image. That's something else that can really bring the viewer in, because it's something the viewer may not pay attention to when they're looking at a scene on any given day. But if you bring them in with those details, that can also go a really long way towards increasing the visual interest of a shot. And finally, I'll just give you one more. Don't give them everything. Abbreviate your scene. I'm a huge proponent of abbreviation in photography. The whole concept of less is more goes a long way. It can be a really powerful component to creating visual interest in your image. If you give your viewer everything in the shot, all the flavors, all the colors, all the sugar, all the subject matter, then you leave them very little room for them to actually engage with your photo on their own cerebral level. It's kind of like, oh, look, there's all that stuff. Okay, great. We see a lot of stuff. Great light, great composition, but, that's it. However, if you only give them part of the scene, then you automatically force your viewer to imagine the rest. You're inviting them to engage their own brains and their own imagination in the viewing process. And this is one thing that will definitely make a difference, because whenever your viewer engages their own brain in the viewing process, their interest is automatically piqued, guaranteed. And so by only giving them part of the story, you allow them to fill in the blanks in their mind of, well, what's outside the frame, or what's over here, what did he leave out? What else could be in this scene? What's the environment I'm looking at? There's so many different things they can imagine and think about as they process the shot in their own minds. Maybe you're already doing some of those. In any case, I hope these tips help you and all the other viewers on your journey in your eternal quest to create stronger, more effective, more compelling images. And that brings to mind something I forgot to mention at the beginning of the video. If you're watching this video and you hear a question that you know the answer to, or that you might have different insights surrounding this topic that I might have shared in the video, feel free to jump in the comment section and answer and share your own ideas. And so this applies right here, especially with this question, is, if you have specific tips or ideas that have helped you increase the drama and strength of your own photos, by all means, please share them. Question number 3 comes from Mike from Erie, Pennsylvania. What are your feelings on third-party lenses? I find that I prefer my brand name 16 to 55mm over the inexpensive 35 and 12mm lenses I have. Mike, the question of lenses is a very universal one, and it's relatable to everybody who's ever shopped for a new lens for their camera, whether it's their first lens or their 100th lens. In most cases, original manufacturer brand lenses are usually very good. We all know that Fuji makes great lenses, Nikon's made great lenses over the years, Canon makes good glass, Olympus makes good glass. Of course, within each brand, there are lenses that are more superior in the line, and some that are more budget lenses that don't perform as well. And this is usually reflected in the price, which makes for a pretty easy benchmark for how good a lens is going to be. If it's really cheap, then it might not perform as well as something that costs a lot more. But that's not to say that all less expensive lenses aren't good, because there are some lower price kit lenses that are very good quality. One thing that makes it even trickier is that there are lens companies that make lenses for other brands as well. So even though you have a third-party lens, it might actually be made by one of the brand names, and vice versa. You might have a brand name lens that might be manufactured by a different company. And especially right now, there's a huge number of new third-party companies making lenses for different camera brands. Some of these are very good, some of these, eh. And this is where you're going to have to either go by your own trial or be very diligent about reading reviews and see what other people think. Most of the time, you can't go wrong with sticking with your own camera brand lenses. For example, when I shot Nikon, I had almost all Nikon lenses, although I did have a couple Tokina lenses that I loved a lot. And Tokina is now starting to make lenses for mirrorless cameras as well. I just saw that they have an 8mm Fujifilm compatible lens that's coming out this year. Rokinon has a couple of great wide angle and fisheye lenses that are rated to be very good. And in fact, the Rokinon 12mm is considered to be one of the best lenses for astrophotography. And they make that mount for different cameras. These days I'm using the Fujifilm cameras, and all my lenses that I own are Fuji brand lenses, all very good. In the past few years I've used a few different third-party lens brands. I've used Lensbaby. Last year I tried some different 7 Artisan lenses. I was pretty impressed. But for the most part I haven't tried a whole lot of the different brands. I also have a couple of my old Nikon manual lenses that I've used on my X Series bodies with adapters. But for the most part, I tend to use all Fuji brand lenses when I'm out shooting with my X Series cameras these days. Mike actually has another question as well. Aside from those mentioned in your X Series Unlimited book, do you have any new suggestions on camera setup, things like function buttons, MyMenu, etc.? I actually did an entire video on the Fujifilm function buttons, how they work, and what some of my favorite settings are. One that's been set on my cameras for quite a while now is setting my top thumb pad button to RAW. And so whenever I'm shooting in JPEG mode, which is quite often, if I press this button, the camera will set up to shoot the next photo in RAW plus JPEG. So in this way, shooting RAW for me is a decision and not the default way of shooting for me. So if I come across a scene and I'm happy the way it renders inside my viewfinder, I'll probably shoot JPEG. But if there's something about the scene that makes me think that shooting RAW would be a better option, whether I want to process and experiment with some different looks, or if I need to dramatically rescue some of the higher and darker tones in the image, then I can press that function button and have the next frame be captured in RAW. After that shot's taken, it goes back to JPEG, so I can keep pressing that again as often as I want. Of course, if there's an entire sequence that I want to shoot in RAW, I'll simply change it in the Q button menu settings to RAW plus JPEG, and that'll make every shot RAW. But I'll usually change it back because I generally prefer to shoot in JPEG and have RAW be my option instead of the default. Also on my X-T3 and X-T4, both of which have the option to use swipe gestures on the touchscreen to act as function controls, I have those 4 swipes set up to be histogram, pre-shot ES, electronic level, and clarity. Of course, the X-T3 doesn't have the clarity setting, so on that camera I've got the 4th swipe gesture set to something different. So if I'm shooting with my X-T4 and I want to use the clarity setting on a shot, I simply swipe left, and then that brings up the control and I can tap the screen and go up or down on the setting, which makes it very easy and convenient to adjust that particular creative control, or any control that you want to use. Of course, there are so many different options that you have in order to customize your camera by using different function button controls. Most X Series cameras these days have around 40 or more different settings to choose from. So you could customize your camera based on your own shooting style, or based on whatever it is that you're shooting on a particular day. And it's so easy to change any of those. You simply hold the display back button down until you bring up the menu, and then you just navigate to whatever button or swipe you want to change, and then choose from the list. There's no reason you couldn't do that multiple times a day depending on what you're shooting. And this just helps you optimize the camera to be the most efficient creative machine in your own hands. There's also the My Menu, which you can set up, but honestly, with all of the different function buttons, I don't really have that much stuff in My Menu these days. I usually use the function buttons to control all of my customizations. but there's certainly a ton of stuff you can put in the My Menu. And actually, I do have some stuff set up in the video page of My Menu for shooting dedicated video stuff. I have things like the highlight and shadow tone setting, the format and frame rate, microphone options, the zebra setting. So if you have an X Series camera, I would press and hold the display back button, bring up the menu, and just see what choices you have available. And that alone might just spark some ideas for how to best customize your camera. Question number 5 comes from Andrew from Canberra, Australia. Andrew asks, for street photography, would it be a good idea to use continuous low as the default setting? I don't tend to shoot a lot of street photography per se. That being said, when I first bought my camera, I was in college living in Boston, so I pretty much got my start doing street photography. Anyway, there are indeed great benefits to be gained by using continuous mode on your cameras. And continuous low is a good default mode to shoot in sometimes because it allows you to capture small and short bursts of images without writing a ton of frames to your card. For example, if you're shooting a portrait or a street scene and you want to capture the ideal moment, maybe there's some slight variations between the movement of your subject and you want to capture that optimum moment in time, shooting continuous mode is not a bad way to go. Because again, it allows you to capture short sequences which might contain a more ideal frame than all of the rest in that series. And of course, if you're shooting continuous frame rate, you'll probably want to shoot in continuous autofocus mode as well, because there's a good chance that your subject might be moving. But if your subject's not moving relative in the position in the frame, then shooting single autofocus is probably okay. Question number 6 comes from Chris from Jersey. That's Jersey in the Channel Islands, not New Jersey, the state. Very important clarification. Dan, where do I start editing a photo in Capture One, or any other application for that matter? I want to spend the least amount of time editing and still get those important key edits done quickly. For Capture One especially, I would encourage you to visit the Capture One website. They've got a lot of great video tutorials up there that can show you exactly what you want to know. There's tutorials that go in depth in a number of different topics and tools, but there's also some lessons that show you how to quickly go from your initial edits to creating a good-looking photo without spending a bunch of time. Regardless of what program you're using, I think the most important things to focus on when you start editing an image are your white balance, your exposure, and your overall contrast. And those are pretty much the first 3 things at the top of any tool palette in most programs. And there's a reason for that. Those are the things that you want to focus on initially in order to solve those basic problems that you're trying to correct for. Again, exposure, contrast, and overall white balance and hue of the image. And of course, there's the spot correction tool, to get rid of dust spots in your image, things like that. And after that, I think that's when you begin to look more critically at what problems you need to solve in order to make this image pop. And that's where you'll want to dive down into the more specialized tools, but don't go sliding sliders until you've identified the problems that need to be fixed. And I think that's an important thing to stress. So you need to figure out and isolate those specific problems. Is there some distortion and lens correction that needs to be fixed? Is there too much contrast in the midtones? Are the shadows too dark? Are the highlights blown? Is there some selective brightening I can do on part of the scene? So before just going crazy with all the adjustments, I would sit down, look at the image, and make some careful analysis and write down what needs to be done. What are the main problems or issues that this image has? And what are the tools that you can use to rectify those problems? And again, regardless of what software you use, chances are the website for that program is going to have some really good tutorials that show you how to address these common issues. And the last question today comes from David from East London, South Africa. David wants to know my final analysis for the 70-300 and how well it performs when shooting action photography. That 70-300 was released almost a year ago, but it was on back order for a very long time, and so I know that a lot of you guys had to wait quite a few months to get yours. The 70-300 is definitely a great lens, and I've used it to shoot a lot of subject matter, landscapes, nature close-ups, portraits, even some action. It does work for action. It has a very fast linear autofocus motor. Compared to something like the 50-140 or the 100-400, I think you'll find it's not quite as fast, it's not quite as quick when acquiring and tracking subject matter. It is a slower aperture lens, and so that's going to be part of it. Also, those red badge zooms like the 100-400 have incredible performance. I've been so impressed with the 100-400 and how well it tracks motion. The 70-300 does a really good job, but what I found is that you do need a lot of light. In good light it does work quite well, but when the light starts to get dim or you're lacking contrast in the scene, it's going to be a little bit slower. It's going to struggle somewhat. So I'm not going to say it's not capable for shooting action, because it is. It just doesn't have the same level of performance as you'll find with the 100-400 or the 50-140. Of course, the 70-300 is a lot lighter and smaller and less expensive. It just might require some good technique in certain situations and enough light. I actually did a whole video here about how to get the most from your autofocus system, no matter what camera system you're using. So that's going to be a really good reference for anybody who shoots action and things that move. And of course, if any of you guys have the 70-300 and have experience shooting action with it, feel free to chime in the comment section. So that's all we have time for today. Thanks for watching episode 4 of Ask Dan. Please subscribe to my channel. Please leave a comment. You can give me a super thanks if you want to. If you're a Fuji user, you'll definitely want to check out my best-selling ebook, X Series Unlimited. This is a 400-page guide that's going to show you everything you need to know in order to get the best results and have the most fun with your Fuji camera. If you haven't seen the other episodes of Ask Dan, you can find those on the channel, and also get your questions in to be answered on a future episode in the link below. So thanks again for watching. Have fun with your cameras out there, and I'll see you next time.